What's up guys? So today we're going to go through some of my tools. I'm going to show you a few different categories of tools like irons. We're going to go through hot air stations, test equipment, all that stuff. I'm going to let you guys know which tools I like and recommend buying and which ones not so much. So we'll go by category. Obviously we're going to start with soldering irons and we'll move on to things like test equipment and consumables and all that stuff. Full disclosure, I'm not sponsored by any of the tools in this video. I'll give my honest opinions about the tools, but I will put affiliate links in the description for tools I recommend if you guys are interested and want to support the channel. This was something I was a little bit lost with when I first started. I didn't know where to buy tools, what to look for, what I should be buying. So hopefully for any beginners, this will be a helpful video. And for anyone else watching, maybe I'll go through a tool that you didn't know about. And if nothing else, it should be a little bit entertaining. So for soldering irons, I would split them into 4 main types. The first one is something I highly recommend you do not use, which is something like this, especially a fire hazard like this one. But if you have something that looks like this and just plugs directly into the wall, please do yourself a favor and throw this in the garbage. This is going to frustrate you beyond belief. You're going to feel like you're shitty at soldering when in reality, you're just using a bad tool. These have often 0 temperature control, and even if they do, it's just incorrect. And the heating method for the tip is archaic. Also, just look at this tip. This is not something you want to be using in any way, shape, or form. So please, for the love of God, throw this out. So the next category is something like a Hakko iron like this. This is the FX888D. So the station itself looks like this and it's temperature controlled. These irons often have a ton of different kinds of tips you can buy for them. But if you're buying something new, I wouldn't necessarily recommend an iron like this. You can see this core is the only thing that heats up, and this tip essentially just slots onto here and relies on the heat of this to get to the correct temperature. So these don't ever end up being very accurate. They heat up a little bit slow, and it's just kind of an old technology. But I do still use this because it is a nice and powerful iron, and if I ever need a big tip like for wicking and things, you'll see me use this in my videos. The kind of iron I would highly recommend you buy is a C245 or C210 cartridge style iron like this. So this is the C245 iron from Fnercy. Here's the power supply it comes with. You can buy this in a kit with both the C210 and C245 tips. The C245 is a bit bigger and the C210 is just for smaller tips. And you can see the difference in size between the cartridges. These are all the different ones you can buy for the C245 and C210. There's actually tons of different ones you can buy for these irons, but these are the most common ones you'll see. If you're doing micro soldering and tiny work, I highly recommend grabbing a C210 iron. I actually really like the C210. You just have to know when to use it. Because it's so small, it obviously doesn't do an amazing job at heat transfer if you're trying to, let's say, clear ground holes or things. But it does an amazing job on tiny pins. And if you need to do trace repair and stuff like that, this is going to be your best friend. Whereas the C245 is a lot more like the Hakko, but just much nicer. These cartridge style irons will heat up super fast and they're a lot more accurate. Also, the heating element for these irons is actually in the tip itself, as well as a thermocouple to tell what the temperature is of the tip. So they're a lot more precise and they heat up a lot faster because they don't rely on the heating element touching the tip physically. The heating element is the tip. So the handle doesn't really matter all that much, to be honest, with these outside of comfort. What really matters is your power supply you're using and the tips you're using. A lot of people recommend you buy the genuine JBC cartridge style tips. They'll run you about like $50 per tip. You can also grab plenty from AliExpress for cheap, and honestly they work completely fine. The other super nice thing about these cartridge style irons is the distance between the tip of the iron and where your hand is. You can see this is like pretty close, and it's even closer with the C210. And check out the difference between this and the Hakko. So this is obviously a huge difference, and when you're working on small stuff, it's hard to be precise with an iron like this. The other thing I like about this specific iron is the cleaning bristles that it comes with. So it comes with this kind of thing, which is a little bit different than what you would normally get with this like steel wool style stuff. I actually still like this, and I still buy this stuff because it's nice to clean the larger iron tips. But for the smaller iron tips, like for the tweezers, which we'll go over in a second, and with the smaller iron, I really like this sort of style. What I do not recommend using at all is a sponge. The reason I don't recommend using a sponge is just because of the drastic temperature difference of the water in the sponge versus your heated up tip. This is going to create little fractures over time in the coating on your tip, and it will just destroy it a lot faster than if you just use something like this or like this. They often come with an induction stand like this, so let me just show you how this works. So if I turn the iron on, it's going to bring the iron up to a standby temperature like this, and when you pull it out of the stand, it'll automatically turn it on for you. And look how fast that heats up. It's already at 375 Celsius. And when you put it back in the stand, it'll automatically start cooling off and go back to the standby temperature for you. And then after a certain amount of time, it will shut the iron off completely. This is the kind of thing you don't get with an iron like this. This is going to take 10 times as long to heat up, if not longer. And it's also more difficult to change the tips on these. So if you like switching between a few different tip shapes and things, this can be super annoying because this is going to be really hot and you have to take this off. But with these, it's super nice because watch this. Even with the tip on and at 300 or 400 Celsius, you can use these little things in here to pull the tip out just like this. And then you just leave it there, let it cool down. And you can just stick it onto a new one and then you have your new tip all ready to go. And the nice thing about this one is it actually doesn't heat the tip yet. So this is safe to touch and move around and adjust. And then it tells you to put it back in the stand and it will start to turn on again. So this is a super nice feature. I love this iron a ton. I would highly recommend it for sure. We also have these sorts of style irons where they're portable and you can plug them in with USB-C, or sometimes they'll have both USB-C and a DC jack like this. I'll be honest, these actually kind of surprise me with how decent they are. What I will say is that if you do buy one of these, don't have it be the only iron you own. The main reason for that is the power supply. Irons like this generally come with low powered power supplies, and even if you buy a better one, they run at a maximum of about 100 watts. I think 100 watts for this. This is something like 140 watts, but it's split between the two tips. Whereas a station like this is going to run at 200 watts. So there's a lot more power available with these stations versus a portable iron like this. And these can sometimes have trouble staying at temperature, again, because of the power consumption limits that they have. If you do buy one, I recommend getting the C210 version of either the Finersi or another iron. This is just because the power draw limits on this thing doesn't show itself as much with smaller tips like these. And honestly, I used this for quite some time and was super happy with it. So these just came out. These are the secure portable tweezers. The cool thing about these is they actually use C210 tips, which you can get for super cheap on AliExpress. This works pretty well. I'm not quite used to using hot tweezers yet. I'm getting used to using them. The only qualm I have with this is one of the sides is a little bit wobbly compared to the other one. So at a small scale, it can be kind of annoying because they'll misalign. Other than that, it's a cool tool, and I have the same things to say about it that I do about the portable iron like this. All right, so here are the different tip types. These are the conical and bent conical, and then this is the knife tip. I personally like the knife tip a lot because if you need it to be precise, you can use the tip, and if you need a bit more heat transfer, you can use the side. Whereas with these, you're kind of just stuck with precision over heat transfer. But I do really like the bent conical as it does provide a bit more precision than the tip of the knife. And here are the C245 tips. You have a conical tip, a bent conical tip, and then you also have these small and large knife tips. The small one is not quite as small as the C210 equivalent, but it's pretty close. And then you have a bit more of a precise straight conical. So those are the difference between the conical tips. And the last one is my favorite to use on larger irons, which is this C2 tip. And I like this for similar reasons that I like the knife tip, but it's a little bit better for heat transfer. And as far as where to buy soldering irons, I highly recommend just grabbing them from AliExpress. For example, here is the station I have. Keep in mind this is also Canadian dollars, so it's a bit cheaper than this US. So yeah, there you go. That's the USD price. And Finersi is also the one that makes the portable iron I had. And the one I recommended from them is not the O2A like this. This is the C245 tips that are a bit bigger. So I would recommend grabbing the B iron if you get one of these, which will come with the C210 tips for some more precision work. All right, moving on to the next most important thing, which is a hot air station. This is the one I have. It's a Quick 957 DW+. I love this thing. It's actually one of their cheaper models, but I've honestly had no problems with this and I'm a big fan. There are also tons of tip choices similar to irons. I really like the bent tips like this, but what I will say is when you use these, you do sacrifice a little bit of the heat transfer from the heating element to the actual hot air coming out. The other thing to keep in mind about the different tip sizes while you're trying different ones is that the larger tips like this one compared to this one are going to have lower airspeed. So even if you put this at max airspeed, it's going to be a lot stronger with the smaller tip than it is going to be with the bigger tip. But if you're looking for a wider area of heat transfer, you are going to have much more luck with a larger tip like this. Or what I often end up doing is taking off the tip entirely and then just using this to heat things up. But again, you have to be aware, since this is closer to the heating element, it's going to be a lot hotter. So just understanding how heat and airflow works with your specific hot air station is super important. Hot air station is one of those things that I highly recommend getting a name brand for and paying a bit extra for. Look for one that has a blower inside of the unit itself and a tube like this going to the handle. And the only thing that's in the handle is the heating element. These tend to be a bit higher quality and will do the job a bit better than the others. You'll see a ton of these cheap hot air stations that just have a wire going to the handle, and the blower and the heating element are both in the handle. I don't recommend going for these cheap ones. So as far as where to buy a hot air station, I definitely wouldn't recommend AliExpress. You can find some good ones on Amazon, for example this Quick station. However, I highly recommend buying through a reputable reseller such as Louis Rossmann, who has worked with Atten to resell their hot air stations for quite a while now. And honestly, just buy this. Like, this is probably the best you're going to get for your money for a hot air station. And as a plus, he sells it with the bent nozzles, which is pretty awesome. All right, the next category is going to be different kinds of solder, and we're going to throw Wick in here while we're at it. Solder can be split into two main categories, which is unleaded solder and leaded solder. Unleaded solder has a higher melting temperature, and it's much harder to work with than leaded solder. I actually don't even own any unleaded solder, and I just buy this stuff. Now, within the category of leaded solder, while it does have a lower melting temperature, there are differences that you should be aware of. The primary difference is going to be the alloy used to create the solder. This is a very common mixture you'll find on sites like Amazon, and it's 60% tin and 40% lead. I don't actually recommend this kind of solder because it actually has a bit of a higher melting temperature than the other leaded solders. But the primary reason I wouldn't recommend this is because it has a bit of a weird melting and solidifying range, if you will. In other words, when you get it melted, it has this weird state where when you remove heat, it sort of slowly solidifies instead of solidifying at a specific temperature. Some people say they think this is easier to work with, but I'm personally not a big fan of it, and I find it's easier to create worse joints with. Also, when it solidifies, it has a bit more of a dull color. So the alloy that I would recommend is 63% tin and 37% lead. This is my favorite kind of solder right here. This is considered eutectic solder, and that's because it is the lowest melting point of all the alloys. It also has this sort of point at which it immediately solidifies. And in my opinion, it's the easiest solder to work with, and you can make super nice joints with this stuff. You'll also see some other information about how much flux is in this. You can see this actually has a bit higher amount of flux than this does. You also have a diameter here listed. You can see this stuff is 0.8 millimeters while this stuff is 0.6. Because I'm working with smaller components, I really like the 0.6 millimeter stuff. I also have some other eutectic solder from Mechanic, and it's at 0.3 millimeters. So it's about half the diameter of this, and it's a lot smaller. I recommend getting a few different sizes for yourself just to see what you like. All right, just as a quick demonstration of the eutectic solder versus the 60-40 solder, here is the 60-40 solder. Then we'll try with the 63-37. So once I clean this up, you'll be able to see pretty clearly the difference between these two, at least look-wise. This eutectic solder is a lot shinier and does melt at a lower temperature, and then this one is just sort of a little bit more like tarnished looking. And while we're on the topic of melting temperature, this stuff is called low melt solder or chip quick, or there's a few different names this stuff goes by. It's a little bit expensive for how much you get, but you don't need a lot and it lasts quite a while. The only thing you want to use this for is mixing it in with factory unleaded solder to make it easier to remove components from the board. You don't want to be using this in any way to solder components to the board. It has a super low melting temperature, and even just the heat of a device running is enough to essentially melt this stuff. So you don't want to be using this in any way, shape, or form for soldering. It's just for desoldering. Solder can also come in tubes like this, but I don't particularly recommend this format. It's kind of annoying to work with. And these rolls are really nice because you can put them on a stand like this where it feeds through these little tubes. You can see I actually have two, one for wire and one for solder wire. And I actually get my braid on a roll like this because I much prefer this over these annoying little plastic things. You also have different formats of solder, so you don't just have solder wire like these. You actually have stuff called solder paste, and this is the stuff I get. It's from Mechanic, and it's actually a mix of flux and super tiny solder balls. You'll see what I mean if I zoom in on this stuff under the microscope. So you can see it's just like this paste stuff, but if you get really, really close, you can see it's actually just like a ton of really small solder balls mixed in with flux. So it's pretty cool. This stuff is super useful for reballing, and a lot of people use it for SMD or surface mounted soldering as well, along with stencils and things like that. The last type of solder we'll look at really quick are just solder balls. These are obviously for reballing chips. I also recommend getting 6337 leaded solder balls. This is just so you don't have to apply so much heat to the chips while you're soldering them on. And these also come in different diameters. You get, I think, about 25,000 in each little vial. But if you look at the smaller diameters, the same amount of solder balls takes up significantly less of the vial. This also just goes to show you the different kinds of reballing you'll run into. Reballing with these smaller ones, for example, like with the max power regulator chips on the Switch, is significantly more annoying than reballing something with larger solder balls like a Southbridge. And that brings us to Wick. This is the kind of wick I buy. It's MG Chemicals Super Wick. I'm super happy with it, and I really like how it comes on a roll like this, so I can just pop it on my stand. You definitely always want to use flux with this stuff. I honestly hate the stuff that comes in these stupid plastic things. I don't understand why these got popular. You're like buying the smallest amount of wick at once. I know there's some really great wick that comes in this format, so don't use that as an indicator for what to buy in any way. That's just me complaining. And as far as flux goes, this is the one I'm using at the moment. I have a video on this if you want to check that out. It's the Mechanic M35 Nano Flux Paste. I honestly haven't tried all that many different kinds of flux. I just stuck with like cheap 559 M-Tech clone forever. So this is the first time I'm actually like branching out and trying new flux. So I recommend you try a few different things there and find what you like. And again, for solder and braid, you can totally get good stuff on AliExpress. I'd recommend the Mechanic solder. This stuff comes in a bunch of different sizes. So you can get, again, 0.2 is super small and 0.8 is pretty big. All right, and here is my microscope that I have. This all came in a kit with the stand, but I found to remove glare that the best thing was to add a little diffuser to this. This is just a piece of like craft felt paper, and I find it does a great job at diffusing the LED. I'll show you one other trick as well to reduce glare. So you can see there's quite a bit of glare right now. All you have to do is just have angled lighting instead of direct lighting. So you could just take your microscope and do this with it and watch. The glare's gone. This might not work as well if you have like an optical microscope. A lot of people swear by it because it gives you that like sort of depth of field. I've never honestly had much of an issue using a digital microscope like this. I end up angling my camera a lot anyways to try to get a better view on whatever I'm soldering. So like for example, if I'm doing an HDMI port, it sometimes can be hard to see the pins from like straight up and down angle, and you want to just angle it like this anyways. Obviously not an HDMI port here, but you get the idea. By all means, spend $100+ on an anti-glare light, but I find just adding a diffuser to the microscope light and angling the microscope works for me. Here is the microscope kit. I don't think this is available on Amazon anymore, but you can grab these individual parts from AliExpress. So here's the microscope camera. It just comes in a few different colors, all the same camera and sensor and stuff. Here's the model number, HY5299. And then here's the 180 times zoom lens, which I'm really happy with. Honestly, don't think you need anything bigger than this. This goes really far in. Let me just show you how far in this can go. This is like plenty to check solder balls underneath a BGA chip, or to be able to check like solder joints on an 0201 component like this. So this is a nice lens. And then I also recommend grabbing a Barlow lens. I have a 0.5 times Barlow lens. What this does is this just allows you to have a larger working distance between the microscope and the thing that you're working on. It's about the size of two of my palms on top of each other like this. If I were to take this lens off, here's what the lens looks like. And again, it's a 0.5 times Barlow lens. You can see if I want to get the same thing in focus without the Barlow lens. Okay, there, it's in focus now. Let me show you how close I have to have this. It's not even one palm width away from the board. So I have this much space to work versus this much space to work with this lens. So Really important to grab one of these for sure. And if you're using this same kind of lens, you're gonna need something that has something called a C mount like this. And you also really want one of these things where you can turn the knob and make fine adjustments to the height of the microscope. So either something like this with a big base. I actually don't use it exactly like this. I have this backwards and have a bunch of weight on the back of it so it doesn't move. Or you can clamp it to your desk like this. Just some way to make it so it's not wobbly or anything. What I probably wouldn't recommend is a flimsy boom stand like this. These are very likely going to be a little bit too shaky, especially with how heavy the microscope is. It's going to be a lot more difficult to make fine adjustments with something like this versus something sturdy like this. I know you can get some like heavy duty boom stands, but to be honest, if you want one of these that's not going to be wobbly and flimsy, you're probably better off grabbing one from a different website. All right, so the next category is cleaning supplies. This is one of those things that I feel like just goes unsaid a lot of the times, which confuses me because this is arguably half of the time I spend on a board I spend cleaning up from the work I'm doing or cleaning up someone else's old work. And honestly, it took me a little while to find the stuff that I liked that worked well to clean, especially like cleaning Flux and stuff. So I'll start with gloves. This is actually only something I realized recently, but I used to buy these gloves just from a pharmacy or Walmart or something. The problem with all of the gloves you're gonna find there is they're pretty thin and they're a little bit annoying because they rip a little bit too easy. The reason these rip so easy is because the ones you buy at the store are 4mm gloves and they're a bit thinner. So if we pull one of these out, it stretches nicely without tearing, but it will puncture pretty easy if you, for example, catch it with your tweezer and then it just rips really easy. So this can kind of get annoying. This is why I highly recommend grabbing these 5mm gloves or even 6mm. The reason I like the 5mm ones is because they still give you some feeling in your fingers, so it's not like they're too thick, but they are nice and sturdy and rip far less easy. So something to think about when buying gloves, and I really like the SureSafe brand. They make a ton of different thicknesses if you want to try different ones out. The next thing I'll talk about is different kinds of alcohol. So I highly recommend grabbing 99% isopropyl. I don't recommend 90% stuff. A lot of times at Walmart, you can only find like 90%. Go to like a pharmacy and grab 99% or order like a big jug of 99%, even better. This is primarily because you want alcohol that evaporates fast. I'll often use hot air to speed up the process of evaporation. It's far less annoying to wait for the stuff to evaporate if it's 99%. So as far as ways you can dispense it, I really like this. This is from Mechanic, but you can grab these all over AliExpress. It's just like this little thing that you press and the alcohol comes up in here. And what's nice about this one is it has a little bead in it so that the alcohol can't go back into it. So if you use a Q-tip here that's already dirty or something, it won't contaminate the rest of the alcohol inside. The other nice thing about this thing is it pushes down really easy. I used to use this. This works. If you just go to Walmart, you can get nail polish remover in these bottles and just dump it out and replace it with alcohol. The downside is these are a little harder to press down, especially if you just grab a Q-tip and you want to press down, it kind of just like bends the Q-tip, whereas with this, I can pretty easily press it down with no issues. And this thing is like $2 on AliExpress, so I would just recommend grabbing this. What I also recommend grabbing are some of these. These are super nice. You just fill them up with alcohol, and they have a little needle thing where you can dispense the alcohol from. And this is nice if you want to just like squirt some alcohol in a port or something like that. Super nice to have and really cheap too. Compressed air is generally a must, and I'm assuming most people have this. For God knows what reason, this stuff costs a fortune. I actually might, instead of using this, grab one of those little high-powered blowers, but I haven't tried one of those out yet, so maybe I'll do that after I run out of this stuff. All right, so the next thing I'll cover are Q-tips. This is actually one of those things that I'm like super picky about, and I'll show you exactly why. So here are the Q-tip brand, which I used to use a long time ago. And let me show you the difference between these and the ones I found on Amazon that are absolutely incredible. So these come in boxes of 1,000, and you just get little packets like this that I just used to fill up a dispenser, and it's a perfect size to fill this up. And let me show you the difference between these two. All right, so if we look under the microscope, the one on the right here is the Q-tip brand, and this is the other brand I found. They are night and day. If you try to like clean stuff with this, the hair from this Q-tip gets all over the board and it starts to snag on things. This is like a complete mess. Whereas with this, you can rub this on boards. I mean, yeah, it doles it out and stuff, but it's so compacted that it doesn't like get hair all over the board. You can see huge difference between the two. But let me just show you, like here are the Q-tip branded ones. You can see they're pretty inconsistent and not very well compacted. And here is the ones I like. You can see they're all super neat and compacted, and they work so much better for cleaning things, especially in tight spaces. So as silly as it sounds to be picky about Q-tips, it's actually one of the things I spent the longest amount of time trying to find ones I liked. And I buy a ton of these because I'm so scared they're going to remove them from Amazon and I won't be able to find ones I like again. So these are the ones I stick with. And now comes brushes and Kim wipes. This is my preferred way of cleaning Flux, is to use various brushes in combination with these things. I love these things. They're super nice to just clean in general. It's nice for Flux, but it's also nice for just general, like cleaning your mat, cleaning your tools. You can find these on Amazon. You can buy 3 boxes at once, and this will last me around like a month maybe per box. But I love these things. These are great. And onto brushes. The main brushes I actually use are these two. You'll see me using these a bunch. These actually just came with some of my solder masks, and I actually just cut this brush in half. And this is the perfect balance of like stiff enough to clean, but also soft enough to not knock stuff off the board. And this one's just like a super delicate one. This is nice to have if you need to clean inside of like a FPC connector or something like that you need to be very delicate with. I honestly don't use these kinds of brushes as much. I find them to be a little stiff. These kind of suck, to be honest. If you see these that just have like the heat shrink tubing and the metal here, they're held together by like a tiny bit of glue and just squeezed with the metal part. And I find they just like are pretty cheap quality and they're not nice to use, to be honest. So not a big fan of these. But what I really like are these little mechanic brushes. I find the size of them to be a bit nicer than this, and they're definitely higher quality and stay together better than these. You can see like the hairs are coming out of this, and it's just poor quality. But these stay together super nice. And the nice part is you can like change these little heads, and they just sell these separately. So if you want to replace these because they get nasty or whatever, you can get a few different little attachments for these. This one is like a wire brush. This is nice to have. It's super abrasive, so you have to be careful with this, but it can come in handy. And they also sell this one that's just like a double-sided one, but I honestly like the 2 individual ones a little bit better than this. And finally, I recommend you grab some soft brushes like these. This is just like a makeup brush. I primarily use this for just cleaning like heat sinks and things. I wouldn't necessarily recommend using this kind of thing on a board because it can cause static. This brush is super nice. I reviewed this on a previous video, I think, but it's from Best, and it's like super, super soft. It has a ton of little bristles, and it's safe to use on a circuit board. And this is really nice to clean like BGA chips and areas on circuit boards where there's tons of little resistors and capacitors like behind APUs and things. This is super nice. So this just sort of fell in the category of cleaning for me. It's a fiberglass pen. This can be really nice to remove like a layer of solder mask or gently and slowly scrape off a layer of something. Oftentimes on boards from the factory, there'll be a little coating on top of some boards, which will prevent you from tinning points or pads on the board. So this can come in handy then too, because you can just scrape away that little coating and then you can more easily tin those pads. So this is just nice to have. I would say grab your Q-tips, wipes, and gloves on Amazon. You can find some higher quality stuff there. As far as like the brushes go, you can find all that stuff on AliExpress for dirt cheap, and you can buy a bunch of them. As a quick bonus to the cleaning category, this is kind of its own topic, to be honest, but it's Ultrasonic Cleaner. So this is another one of those things that I don't recommend grabbing from actually either AliExpress or Amazon. All of the ones you're going to find on both of those sites are just jewelry cleaners, and they run at 1 frequency and they can damage your circuit boards. Instead, I recommend grabbing one from a reputable brand that does a sweeping range of frequencies. For example, this Crest does that, and also Branson Ultrasonics sells units that do a sweeping frequency. These will heat up and they will sweep different ultrasonic frequencies to clean the boards, and it does an amazing job. And the other thing you'll need if you're doing ultrasonic cleaning of circuit boards is some cleaning solution to put in your ultrasonic cleaner. There's only a handful of solutions out there that are actually safe to use with circuit boards, and by far the most used one is the Branson EC solution. This one is not directly from Branson because they don't sell in Canada. They sell through Crystal Electronics in Canada, so that's how I got this. For whatever reason, this stuff is super hard to find, and at least in Canada, it has to be shipped as a hazardous material. So it can be a little bit expensive to get this stuff, not to mention the price of it inherently. But the nice thing is you don't have to actually use too much of this every time you fill up your cleaner. You only have to use about 2 to 5% by volume in combination with distilled water. All right, the next category of stuff is tweezers and spudgers. You'll often find sets of the same 6 tweezers on like Amazon or on AliExpress. These are fine. I do use these. They're a little bit inconsistent with how sharp they are, but they work. They're not bad. But what I would recommend is finding some nice tweezers that are a bit more designed for their use case. These are sort of similar to these. They're just a little bit nicer and feel a bit nicer to use. This mechanic tweezer is probably my favorite straight tweezer, solely due to the fact that because it's so long, it's really easy on the fingers to hold a tiny component for a long period of time and easily transfer it from one board to another or something like that. I find with these sort of shorter ones, you have to press a bit harder, and it really does make a difference when you're at a microscopic scale with like an 0201 component or something. Your fingers are having trouble being precise while pressing the tweezers together. So these tweezers are super nice for that because they're super long and they make it really easy to push together. So I really like these. Definitely highly recommend grabbing a pair. By far my favorite tweezers out of all of them are these. They're titanium tweezers. And they are super sharp, and you probably can't see it on the camera, so I'll show you what I mean. All right, so here is the sharpest one from that group of tweezers, and here is the titanium tweezers. So you can see just how much smaller these are than any of the other tweezers. They're like sharper than needles. So like here's an actual needle and here's the tweezer next to it. And you can see mine are actually a tiny bit bent, but it takes a lot to bend them. I mean, if you drop them, and they'll definitely bend. But yeah, they're not like crazy expensive, and I totally recommend grabbing one of these. Definitely grab a pair of straight ones and then a pair of bent ones like this. I actually want to grab another set of these because mine are pretty heavily used. Definitely the tweezer I use the most. These are super nice for like scraping traces on boards and doing trace repair. I do sometimes use the grinding pen, but even with the sharpest tip on the grinding pen, it's very unsturdy for really small traces, and you don't want to be using this kind of thing because you'll just tear through the miniature traces with this. That's why these come in handy. Speaking of bent tweezers, this is super nice for that kind of thing. You can just look up M40 on AliExpress, and it's just a little like grinding stone, and you can just take your tweezers and grind them if they're bent, and it actually does work pretty well to revive tweezers that you've dropped or bent otherwise. And the last pair of tweezers are a pair of bent tweezers like this. So not bent like this. Well, this is nice. This shape is like incredible. I don't know how to explain it, but it's super nice for grabbing chips off of the board and placing chips while you're trying to solder them. And angles really do make all the difference when you're doing things at this scale. Under the microscope, it can be really frustrating if you're trying to place a chip with straight tweezers like this. It can work, but I promise you when you grab this kind of thing, you won't go back to using straight tweezers for certain chips. Oh, and one of the nicer ones of these are these blunt tweezers. I use these constantly. Sometimes you don't want a pair of tweezers that is sharp. I love these for holding solder wick and things like that. And for like spudgers and things, these are nice to have for opening cases and things like that. I absolutely love these things. I'm actually gonna throw this one out because I've been using this for a while. And they're just like not conductive, so I use these all the time to unplug battery connectors just to be safe. I don't want to be using tweezers for that kind of thing. But yeah, I love these things. These are just all around pretty useful. I use them to clean thermal paste as well. Just a nice all around little disposable tool to have. This is designed to help you manage like BGA chips and clean underfill, especially on like mobile phone work. You'll see a lot of people using this. These are really nice to have. It's just like these little thin pieces of metal that are different shapes. They go on the end of a handle, kind of like a razor blade. They're not particularly sharp. I mean, they're thin, but they're super flexible, and they can be really nice in conjunction with alcohol to remove glue. And you can also scrape using some of these sharper points that are like hooks. So really love this tool. For whatever reason, I find myself using this like rounded one constantly. It's a big help, and it's pretty cheap to grab this. It also comes with a ton of different attachments. Oh, it also comes with some more like sturdy attachments. Like I think it's just these two. It's cut from a different, thicker piece of metal than these are. These are a bit thinner, more floppy, while these are a bit more sturdy and can help you with scraping away at glue and stuff. And case in point about the gloves, you can see I ripped my glove just by messing with these. That's because I'm still using the 4mm gloves that I was saying not to buy. I'm not trying to waste them, so I'm just trying to use them up. Every single one of those tools you saw, you can grab on AliExpress for super cheap. And again, I'll have links in the description for all this stuff by category, so you can buy it if you want. Okay, moving on to cutters and insulation and tape stuff. As far as like bent precision pliers go, I actually found it difficult to find ones that are higher quality. A lot of times what happens if you get cheap ones like these sort of start to do this and misalign because this little bolt thing here gets a little bit loose. If you have some higher quality ones like these ones from Hacko, they don't do that nearly as much. And I've had these forever. They're super sharp and really nice for cutting like shields around chips and things. Or whatever you need to cut that's tiny. These are probably my favorite pair of cutters. These are just ceramic cutters. I use these constantly for cutting Kapton tape or just cutting any kind of tape in general or cutting thin bits of wire and stuff like that. These are super nice, and it's nice because they're non-conductive and I keep them out on my mat because of how much I use them. I really like this. I found this, I think at Michael's actually. It's just like a nice ergonomic X-Acto knife that you just hold like this. And it allows you to be a little bit more precise than you would be with this kind of thing because it anchors it to your finger. So if you ever need to cut like a tiny trace or be very precise with an X-Acto, I find this to be super helpful. This grinding pen, I'm not gonna lie, is a little bit overrated for trace repair and stuff like that. I don't actually recommend using this for that because it's a little bit aggressive for trace repair. You can use it, but it's easy enough honestly to do trace repair with just some sharp tweezers like this, and you have a lot more control over scraping back exactly what you need. What this is super nice for is if you need to dig into a few layers of a board to do trace repair under like the third layer of the PCB. You obviously have to be super careful when you're doing that kind of work, but it goes a bit faster if you use something like this compared to tweezers. So that's where I would recommend this kind of thing. All right, on to tape. I wouldn't recommend using electrical tape for most things. It does have its uses. What you should grab is Kapton tape. Kapton tape is heat resistant, safe tape to use on PCBs. And if you do grab some of this, I do recommend grabbing the ceramic scissors. And double-sided tape just comes in handy, so I just threw it in there. And now solder mask. This is one of those things that I honestly had a lot of trouble with early on, and it was because I didn't realize if you have an LED UV light like this, don't try to use this for curing solder mask. You're going to be really confused why it's not working or curing. It's just simply not powerful enough. You need a higher wattage UV curing lamp like this kind of thing. I definitely recommend the Mechanic UV lamp. They have two versions of this, one where it just plugs into a USB port and it powers that way, and one like this where it has a battery. They have a delay as well. So I usually just cure for 60 seconds, clean, and then do another 60 seconds, and it cures perfectly. And as far as solder mask goes, I recommend this Mechanic stuff. It works great as well. UV mask also comes in a bag like this usually, where it's protected from sunlight. I definitely recommend keeping it in here. I sort of just like neglected mine and left it out for a while. And then the whole outside of the tube ends up curing, and then you can't actually use the syringe in here. So definitely store this in a dark place or in a bag like this. All right, next we have test equipment. So for multimeters, I used to use this one. The problem with this is if I put these leads together, you can see in ohms range, it's only 1 decimal place. Lowest is about 0.8 ohms. And then on this one, we've got a significantly lower resistance. And the other nice part about this is you can use the relative setting, which just removes the resistance of the leads from the equation. So then you can go and measure things, and 0 will actually be 0. And this is just overall a more accurate meter. I also like it because I can plug it into my computer with the USB cable and give you guys a view of what I'm seeing. Right now it's unplugged, so it's frozen. And this particular model has a battery in it, which is why it's still on. I think there's 2 different numbers. It's 1240 or 1241. 1241 just comes with a battery. If you're interested in this meter, I highly recommend checking out the Hardware Caves video series about the meter. You'll see he has a few parts going over this meter super in depth. and I highly recommend his channel as a whole. While we're talking about multimeters, these leads, I really like them. They're from AliExpress, and you can change the tips on them. So you can unscrew these, and if they get bent or dull, you can just buy these little tips and replace them. These leads also are a little bit of a lower resistance in general than normal ones you would find. And I really like these because they have like a soft cable, so they're not like super stiff and really annoying. These leads are also significantly sharper than the precision leads that you can get from Amazon. These are just normal leads, but I'll show you the difference between these and the precision ones I have. All right, so this is the normal lead. And then here is the precision lead you can get from like Amazon. And then here is the leads I just showed you. So super small and lower resistance, and I like them a bunch, especially if you're measuring on like an 0201 component when you're all the way zoomed in. Just check out the difference between these and how much this one would get in the way of measuring a tiny pin compared to this one. And here are the little tip replacements it comes with. It comes with, I think, 2 sets of tips. This is one of them, also pretty sharp. Not quite as sharp as the other one, but still super sharp. And not to mention the nice little foam grips it comes with. I'm really liking these leads a lot. They definitely do the job. As far as power supplies go, definitely be careful looking on Amazon and other sites for bench power supplies, because all of the ones you see here are going to be switching power supplies. And if it's not listed, it's almost definitely switching unless it has a bit of a higher price. Like this one is very likely a linear. You can tell because it's a lot bigger. But yeah, 99% of these are going to be switching power supplies. This is actually the one I own, and I really like this one. I'll put a link for this in the description. Again, it allows me to connect it to the computer, and it's an overall just really nice linear power supply. Along with the power supply, if you're working on laptops ever, get yourself one of these, where you can just cut the wire and attach it to your power supply, and then you can just use the different tips that it comes with. And then you don't have to solder wires to the charging port to boot it with your bench power supply. And the next thing we'll talk about are these little USB testers. You can, if you want, grab one that supports both USB-C, USB-A, and I think micro USB. So you can get like an all-in-one one of these. I just cover my bases with the USB-A, which you can put inline on most USB cables. And then the USB-C one is good for like PD devices. For example, like switch consoles and laptops that have PD charging. For example, here is a switchboard, which I can plug in. And you can see it shows you the amount of current draw and the voltage going into the board. So this is super useful. Definitely grab one of these if you don't have one already. And one of the other tools I highly recommend is this P2 Pro thermal camera. This thing is a beast. It's a little bit expensive, but if you're doing repairs on any kind of a regular basis, definitely grab this thing. It is easily one of the best and most versatile thermal camera sensors that you can get for the money at the moment. And it's really designed for this kind of work, especially with the macro lens. You'll see me using this all the time. And to be honest, this is not only useful for debugging like shorts and things. While it is super good at that, it's really nice for checking thermals on a laptop or a console that's overheating. For example, recently I had a Switch console come in that I couldn't figure out why it was overheating. I had fully cleaned the console, replaced the thermal paste, the fan was running and stuff. But what I discovered was that the fan motor was actually overheating, and you could see with the thermal cam a huge red spot like directly on the fan. So even though the fan was spinning and running, it just wasn't running fast enough and it was failing. So that was a super helpful indicator as to where the heat was coming from in the console. A lot of the heat was coming from the fan itself. The fan was getting hotter than the APU was, and obviously was not providing sufficient cooling. So this has a lot more uses than you'd think. I also love that you can plug this into your phone, but you can also plug it into the computer. I just have a USB extension cable over here that I just plug into this, and you'll see me use it in plenty of my videos, and I can pipe it straight into OBS and show you guys what I'm seeing. Oh, and a quick note about this, a lot of the other thermal cameras you'll find that have like screens and have a whole like setup with them, you end up paying for all that extra stuff. With this, you're essentially just paying for a really solid sensor, and then you can have software on your phone or on your computer that runs along with this. So just something I want to mention. All right, so the last thing I definitely recommend grabbing if you don't have this already is a chip programmer. The CH341A in particular is a super versatile chip programmer. I have a video up where I use this to read error codes from a PS5 because it also doubles as a UART reader. But this is nice if you ever need to read and write to BIOS chips. At first, I was a little bit intimidated by programming chips, but honestly, it's really not too bad once you start learning it. And this is a great entry point because the thing is like $2 and other programmers are significantly more expensive. So this is a great way to get started with chip programming and a really nice tool to have if you ever need it. As far as reballing tools go, we already went over the solder aspect of that. You have the solder paste and the solder balls. Solder balls are generally used with a jig like this, where you put the chip in here. You adjust these to different sizes with an Allen wrench like this, and then you put the chip in here. And you can also adjust these four on the corners to adjust how high up or down this is in comparison to the chip. If the stencil is too close to the chip, you can raise these up, and if the stencil is too far away from the chip, you can screw these in. This thing is a great little tool. It comes with a bunch of universal stencils. For example, this one fits the Xbox Series X Southbridge chip. This one fit the PS5 SSD controller. You can see a video on my channel about that. So while this won't cover all of your bases for reballing, it is nice to have these universal stencils, and you can tape them off with some Kapton on tape. And the idea is you put the stencil in this part and the chip in here, and you put this on. You pour solder balls into here that are the correct size, and you wiggle it around. And the thin layer of flux that you put on the chip beforehand will stick all of those solder balls to the chip, hopefully instead of the stencil. And you essentially push down on this, which separates the chip from the stencil perfectly vertically. So it's super well machined, and it just perfectly pushes it down. And then you can grab the stencil on the way back up, and you have your reballed chip, which you can then put on the preheater or use hot air to melt the solder balls. So this is a great tool. I highly recommend this thing. It comes with the stencils and the jig and all the solder ball sizes you could ever want. And it also comes with this nice little vacuum tool with the different size suction cup things, and it just lets you pick up the chip. So nice if you want to pull it off of the board vertically without smearing components around. So that all comes as a kit. And then you have the direct heated stencils. The difference between these two is you're not supposed to heat these stencils directly with the hot air. You're supposed to separate it from the chip before you heat the chip. Whereas these stencils and this jig are designed to be heated directly. Actually, I have some other direct heated stencils here that I forgot to bring in. These are similar to these in the sense that they are universal stencils. You get a ton of them. So again, similar sort of universal templates that you can either tape off or just use directly with the jig. And the nice part about these stencils is you don't necessarily even need to use it with the jig. You can just put the chip on a paper towel or a Kimtac wipe and directly reball using solder paste from there. And you can spread the solder paste over the stencil using a tool like this, or you can use the little BGA tool for that kind of thing as well. And this one is just a bunch of different like VRAM/RAM stencils, but it's the same idea. You can also buy stencils that are specific to certain chips or certain devices. For example, I have some here for the Switch motherboard. This one is actually just a universal one that I use for the Switch eMMC. And then this is the Switch APU. And this is for like the Switch VRAM and the Max chips and stuff like that. So these are also all designed to be directly heated. This little preheater also comes in handy. It's really nice to just pop the reballed chip on here, especially if you're doing reballing with actual solder balls. And that allows the solder balls to melt without having to worry about using hot air and blowing all of the solder balls off of the chip. This is also really nice for smaller boards like the Switch motherboard and stuff like that to preheat the board. You can't really use this kind of thing for preheating larger boards. You need a proper preheater for that. I'm working on looking into some nicer preheaters for larger boards. For now, I've just been honestly using hot air to preheat the underneath of boards, and it does work. It is a lot more convenient though to have a large like IR preheater. So you'll probably see me do a review of one of those in a future video when I grab one. So I hope you guys enjoyed the tool video. This is not all the tools I have, but it is a large majority of them. And I hope it was at least a little bit helpful in figuring out where to start with buying tools and what kinds of tools you need if you're just getting started with micro soldering and repair. So I appreciate you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.